Well then, Mr. Buckley, you may call your first witness. The state calls Nora Cobb. The mother of the murdered rapist sat in the witness box and listened to Rufus Buckley as he asked her where she lived and what had happened on the day her son, Billy Ray Cobb, was killed. As Nora Cobb told her story, she started to cry. She was not a witness who could do much damage to Carl Lee, and normally Jake would not ask her any questions. But then he saw an opportunity he could not miss. He could wake up Judge Noose and start making the jury think about what people like Billy Ray Cobb were really like. He also felt that Nora Cobb's tears were the result of good acting, not deep regret. "Just a few questions," Jake said as he stood up. "Mrs. Cobb, is it true that your son sold drugs?" "Objection!" Buckley shouted, jumping to his feet. "The criminal record of the victim cannot be mentioned in court." "Sustained." Mrs. Cobb wiped her eyes and started to cry harder. "You say your son was 23 when he died. In his 23 years, how many other children did he rape?" "Objection! Objection!" shouted Buckley again, waving his arms and looking desperately at Judge Noose. "Sustained! Sustained, Mr. Briggins! You cannot ask these questions!" Mrs. Cobb burst into tears, and the sound of her crying filled the shocked courtroom. But Jake had made his point. The jury would now remember the sort of man Billy Ray Cobb had been. The next witness was Ernestine Willard, the mother of the other victim. She was less of an actress than Mrs. Cobb, but Rufus Buckley asked her the same questions he had asked the first witness, and brought the same tears to her eyes. When he had finished, Jake stood up. "Mrs. Willard, I'm Jake Briggins." He stood in front of her and looked at her without pity. "How old was your son when he died?" 27. Buckley pushed his chair from the table and sat on its edge, ready to jump up. Noose removed his glasses and leaned forward. "During his 27 years, how many other children did he rape?" Buckley immediately shouted, "Objection! Objection! Objection! Sustained! Sustained! Sustained!" The shouting frightened Mrs. Willard, and she cried louder. But, once again, Jake had made his point. Ozzie was the first state witness after lunch. Buckley questioned him first, asking him to repeat exactly what had happened on the day of the murder. He then showed Ozzie the gun that Carl Lee had used, and asked him to say if this was the one he had found near the bodies. To finish, he then brought out a set of color photographs of the murder victims, some taken so close you could see how the bullets had broken through the skin and bone. Rufus Buckley made the jury members look at each picture, pointing out the horror of the way the two men had died. He wanted them to remember the violence of what Carl Lee had done. Jake looked at his notes as he walked across the courtroom. He had just a few questions for his friend. "Sheriff, did you put Billy Ray Cobb and Pete Willard in jail?" "Yes, I did," answered the sheriff. "For what reason?" "For the rape of Tanya Haley." "And how old was she at the time of the rape?" "She was 10. "Is it true, Sheriff, that Pete Willard signed a written document saying that he had raped Tanya Haley?" "Objection! Objection! Your Honor, we can't discuss this case, and Mr. Briggins knows it." Ozzie had already said yes. "Sustained." "Please ignore the last question from Mr. Briggins," Noose told the jury. "No further questions," said Jake. The next two witnesses gave technical evidence to show that Carl Lee Haley had, as everyone knew, killed Cobb and Willard. Again, Buckley bored the jury by going into great detail and asking long and complicated questions. The jury members were becoming increasingly tired of the sound of his voice. When it was Jake's turn to ask questions, he said that he had none. The second day of the trial started in the same way, with the jurors in their seats by 9 o'clock. Rufus Buckley brought in his next witness, the doctor who had examined Cobb and Willard's bodies. Again, Buckley talked too long and asked too many questions. No one was denying that Cobb and Willard had been killed with an M16 or that Carl Lee had killed them. So why spend so much time on it? The jury members were bored, and the judge spent a lot of time cleaning his glasses in order to stay awake. Once again, when it came to Jake's turn, he looked at the judge and said, "I have no questions." Judge Noose and the jurors all smiled. It was becoming clear which lawyer they preferred. But Buckley still didn't seem to understand what he was doing wrong. The last witness was Officer Dwayne Looney. Buckley had chosen him to speak last as a way of reminding the jury of the damage Carl Lee had done. Looney walked into the courtroom with difficulty, leaning on a stick. Buckley asked Deputy Looney his age, where he worked, and who he took to the courthouse on Monday, May 20th. He then asked what had happened when he had taken the men out of the court. Deputy Looney described how he had led the prisoners out of the court and how suddenly Carl Lee had come out of a side room. "Then what happened?" asked Buckley. "When Cobb was near to the foot of the stairs, the shooting started. I was waiting to go on down. I didn't see anybody for a second. Then I saw Mr. Haley with the machine gun. Cobb was blown backward into Willard, and they both screamed and fell down, trying to get back up to where I was." "Yes, sir. Please describe what you saw." "You could hear the bullets coming off the walls and hitting everywhere. It was the loudest gun I ever heard." "What happened to you?" "I never got down the stairs. I think one of the bullets came off the wall and caught me in the leg." "And what happened to your leg?" "They cut it off," he answered softly. "Just below the knee." "Did you get a good look at the man with the gun?" "Yes, sir. It was Mr. Haley, the man sitting over there." That answer was a good place to stop asking questions. But Buckley then took out large plans of the courthouse and arranged them in front of the jury so that Looney could walk around and show his bad leg. Jake rubbed his forehead, and Noose cleaned and re-cleaned his glasses. The jurors moved around in their chairs. Buckley had lost them again. "Any questions, Mr. Briggins?" Noose asked at last. "Just a few questions. Officer Looney, who was Carl Lee looking at when he was shooting?" "Those boys, I think." "Did he ever look at you?" "I don't think so." "So he didn't aim the gun at you?" "Oh, no, sir. He just aimed at those boys. Hit them, too." "What did he do when he was shooting?" "He just screamed and laughed like a crazy man. It was the strangest thing I ever heard. With all the noise, the gun firing, the bullets whistling, the boys screaming as they got hit. Over all that noise, I could hear him laughing that crazy laugh. That's what I'll always remember." The answer was so perfect that Jake had to fight off a smile. He and Looney had worked on it 100 times, and it was a thing of beauty. Every word was perfect. Jake looked through his notes and then looked up at the jurors. They were all waiting for the next question. Jake wrote something down and then looked carefully at Looney, just to make the silence last a few more seconds. Now, Deputy Looney, Carl Lee Haley shot you in the leg. Yes, sir, he did. Do you think he meant to? No, sir. It was an accident. I do not want to see him punished for the shooting, sir. I have no bad feelings about the man. I would do the same. Buckley dropped his pen and sat back in his chair. He looked sadly at his star witness. What do you mean by that? Jake asked. I mean, I don't blame him for what he did. Those boys raped his little girl. I've got a little girl. If somebody raped her, I'd kill him just like Carl Lee did. We should give him a prize. Do you want the jury to find Carl Lee guilty? Buckley jumped and shouted, Objection! He can't ask that question! No, Looney shouted. I don't want him to be found guilty. He's a hero. Don't answer, Mr. Looney, Noose said loudly. Don't answer. He's a hero. Set him free, Looney shouted at Buckley. Order! Order! Noose banged his table. Buckley was silent. Looney was silent. Jake walked to his chair and said he had no other questions. Looney smiled at the jury and walked slowly and painfully from the courtroom. Chapter 12. A Crazy World. Jake awoke in the darkness to the sound of his doorbell. He opened the front door in his nightshirt and found Ozzie and Deputy Nesbitt waiting for him. What is it? He asked as he opened the door. They're gonna kill you today, Ozzie said. Who? The Klan. How do you know? The same man who told us about the dynamite. He calls himself Mickey Mouse. He telephoned yesterday and said you're the lucky man. Today is the big day. That's why we're here. We're coming to the office with you. We're staying with you all day. At 5:30, they drove Jake to his office and locked the door. At 8, a group of soldiers was waiting on the sidewalk. Harry Rex and Ellen watched from the second floor of the courthouse. Jake walked between Ozzie and Nesbitt, the three of them in the middle of the group of soldiers. The Klansman sat with his gun in his hands at a window in an old empty factory 2 blocks north and east of the square. From his position, he had a clear view of the back of the courthouse. He sat in the darkness and aimed through a small opening, knowing that no one in the world could see him. Another Klan member waited in a pickup down the road. The engine was running, and the driver sat smoking, waiting for the sound of the gun. When he saw the group of soldiers move away from Jake's office, the gunman did not know what to do. He could only see the top of Jake's head in a sea of green army hats. He could not be sure of hitting Jake, but the whiskey he had been drinking made him want some excitement. He aimed and fired, hoping for the best. When they heard the sound of the gun, the soldiers ran toward the courthouse, pulling Jake down with them. One soldier screamed in pain, holding his throat. Another shot, then another. "He's hit!" someone shouted. Jake ran through the doors to the safety of the building. He fell onto the floor and put his head in his hands. Ozzie stood next to him, watching the soldiers through the door. The gunman ran out of the factory and threw his weapon behind the back seat of the pickup. The two men drove out of town. They were going to a funeral in South Mississippi. The soldier had been standing by Jake's left shoulder when he was hit. "This is kind of silly, ain't it?" he had just said to Jake when the bullet shot through his throat. He fell against Jake, holding his neck, losing blood fast and screaming. "He's dead, isn't he?" Jake asked Ozzy softly. "He's dead. I know he's dead. I heard his neck break." They heard later that the soldier did not die, but he was not going to be able to walk again. Jake managed with difficulty to persuade the judge that the trial could wait for another 24 hours. He stayed in the office with Harry Rex and Ellen Rourke. After he had phoned his wife to tell her he was unhurt, he sat with his friends, talking too much and drinking too much. Dr. Bass joined them later in the day, and then Lester Haley arrived with Lucien. Lucien bought more drinks, and by the end of the afternoon, Jake was drunk enough to fall asleep on the floor. Ellen slept on the sofa in Jake's office. When Ellen woke up, the room was dark and empty and smelled of alcohol. She moved around carefully and found her boss peacefully sleeping on the floor in the conference room. It was 10 o'clock. She had slept 5 hours. She could stay at Lucien's house, but needed to change clothes. She locked the front door and walked to her car. Ellen had almost arrived at Oxford when she saw the blue lights behind her. As usual, she was driving at 75 miles an hour. She parked at the side of the road, got out of the car, and waited for the police. 2 men approached from the blue lights. Suddenly, she was knocked to the ground. A heavy blanket was thrown over her, and both men held her down. A rope was tied around her chest and waist. She kicked and swore, but could do little to help herself. One of them removed her keys from the car and opened the trunk. They threw her inside and banged it shut. One of the men then took the blue lights off their car and drove away, followed by the other in Ellen's BMW. They found a side road and followed it deep into the woods, then turned off the road into a small field where a large cross was being burned by a number of Ku Klux Klan members. The 2 men quickly put on their white robes and masks. They pulled her out of the trunk and threw her to the ground. They tied her arms and legs, placed a cloth over her mouth, and dragged her to a large pole a few feet from the cross. They tied her to the pole with her back to the Klan members. The burning cross lit the field. As the heat from the fire started to burn her, she struggled with the ropes, but she couldn't loosen them. She started to make strange crying noises deep in her throat. A masked figure left the others and approached her. She could hear his footsteps, and then felt his breath on her face. "You nigger lover," he said in an educated Midwestern voice. He pulled the collar of her shirt and tore it from her back. He pulled down the zipper on her skirt, and then took out a large knife, cut the skirt and underclothes from top to bottom, and pulled them from around her. She tried to kick, but the heavy rope around her ankles held her feet to the pole. "See what happens to nigger lovers?" he said quietly. "How do you like it?" The fire